welcome to Zelda's Peaches and Biscuits podcast. I'm Elena Doughton, and I'm the executive director of the Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum, located in Montgomery, Alabama, in the Old Cloverdale neighborhood. And I'm joined with
Maura Martello, and I am an author, a playwright. I'm a Zelda researcher and a Zelda sleuth. And welcome, everybody.
So what we're going to try to do with the Zelda podcast is explore all things Zelda, beginning with her childhood before Scott. I think first we should talk about how we became interested in Zelda.
I'll tell you how I became, through my mother, actually, who was a fan of the film Beloved Infidel, which starred Gregory Peck and Deborah Carr as Sheila Graham and F. Scott Fitzgerald. That led her to read the actual book by Sheila Graham, which led her to bring home from the library Nancy Milford's, of course, classic biography of Zelda Sayre Fitzgerald. I read the book. She didn't like the book, actually, but I loved the book. And this was maybe in the mid-'70s. And from then on, I became a Zelda, how would you call it, Elena?
I guess fan.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
Zelda
I'm
fans.
not afraid to say
No,
I'm
we're
a
huge
fan.
Zelda fans. I became interested. I have a local story. I grew up primarily in Montgomery up until high school. My grandmother's a lifelong Montgomery native, as is my mother. And when I was, I think, second or third grade, we were coming out of the grocery store, and this young couple, college-age couple, approached my mother in the parking lot. And the young man said, "Do you know who Zelda is?" And my mother goes, "Of course." And he turns to the young lady, and she goes, "See, everyone knows Zelda." And then the girl says to my mother, "Well, what is she known for?" My mother went, "Swimming in the fountain." I thought, who is this lady that's swimming? I mean, there's only one fountain in Montgomery. It's the Court Square Fountain. So I thought, who is this lady? And I didn't read the biography probably till high school, college, so not till the late 80s, early 90s. But I did grow up in and around the Cloverdale neighborhood. A friend of mine, her family still lives here on Felder Avenue. And I remember when the museum opened and it kind of revived, that kind of wave. I was just about to go to college when they opened the museum. So there was this sense of, I guess I should back up. My grandmother also lived on Goldwaite Street and lived next door to what is now called the Sanctuary, and which was Zelda's former childhood church. And her mother still lived in the neighborhood. And my grandmother remembered Zelda, mainly remembered her mother more. And so Zelda was just kind of this person that, she wasn't famous. She was like an extended family member, if that makes sense.
That's interesting.
So then when you realize there's the book, and now that she's quite famous, I think there's two very different perspectives, because for a lot of people in Montgomery, she's someone that belongs to your family story. Friends, family remember her. We know there's people in the neighborhood who knew her. There's a gentleman here in the neighborhood who has some of her paintings. His mother was one of her classmates. These are all obviously elderly people. But my grandmother remembers her. So for me, Zelda's a person where that's part of the family or the narrative of Montgomery, where Scott seems like a celebrity, someone you read about in school, or someone, like I have no
I think the way I view it is the way a general audience would view Zelda and Scott. You, on the other hand, Zelda was your neighbor, even if she was gone before you were born.
Well, they tell stories of my great-grandmother. They're very similar. My great-grandmother was, I think, similar to Zelda. So in a way, Zelda seems like a great aunt, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
So hopefully we can bring both those perspectives to this podcast. But also, because we're in Montgomery, I think that we have the rare opportunity to kind of recreate for the audience what it was like here in Montgomery when she was young. I know our plan is the first set of podcast or episodes will be her life before Scott, recreating Montgomery. What was her family like? What were her sisters like? Her friends? what was happening in Montgomery. Who was she the day before she meets Scott Fitzgerald? And we kind of want to flesh that out and take as many rabbit holes. And then also, I think our plan is to go through the biographies or take clues from the biographies. So for the listeners, we will be using Nancy Milford. However, we are quite fond of Sarah Mayfield's Exiles in Paradise. My experience is that a lot of Fitzgerald scholars don't regard it as highly, and I think that's because there are no footnotes or notations in the back. And we recently discovered why that is. I was able to go to the University of Alabama archives and see the Mayfield papers, courtesy of the Mayfield estate, and we found that a lot of Zelda's family friends did not want to be quoted because they had not helped other, competing biographies. So she has an enormous wealth of information, particularly from Zelda's sister, some from Scotty, and letters from a lot of their childhood friends who were not directly quoted. So we now have that information. We can share that publicly to some extent. The papers are not open to the public, so FYI. And so I think we're going to search for the clues, the people that she mentions, and then try to first recreate, her life here in Montgomery. And then as it progresses, we will see what Montgomery was like when Scott and Zelda were here together.
And do you think we have different take on Zelda from published authors?
What, the person that they kind of paint?
Yes.
I think very much so. I think Mayfield knew her. Mayfield, I think it's more interesting. Mayfield knew her as a child and then knew her in her final years here in Montgomery. So she knew the Zelda in Montgomery, the youthful Zelda and then the older Zelda. I think Milford, I think we owed a debt of gratitude to Milford, but I do think Milford is limited in that I don't know how forthcoming Montgomeryans were with her. So I think Milford is maybe a bit skewed, not intentionally, but I just don't know how much.
Yeah, it's a
we
narrative.
Just have so much more information now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it is a narrative. It has an arc that may not quite be what reality was.
Yeah.
She was writing for an audience, and it is a very well-written book. It's a literate book.
I think it's the best written.
Yes.
I think Mayfield may be the most insightful, and I think Sally Klein's is the best researched.
Okay.
I
Very interesting.
think Sally Klein's novel, we get the most detail. I think she billed it as meticulously researched. She, I think, really, I know she went to Princeton Archives. I know that Milford did as well, but I have a lot of respect for the Sally Klein. I do think Milford's is written, like you said. I think it's the best written, but I don't know that it's the most accurate.
Yeah, it's also the one biography that filmmakers have always wanted to use.
Yeah. I think that's a rights issue, though.
Maybe.
I think that's a rights. I think, because I know that...
it has drama, let me put it that way. It has...
Yeah, it does. I think the one thing, and it won't be till very down the road, is the issue of Zelda's mental illness. We're really beginning to unravel a lot of that. And I think you also have to look at when they were written. Milford and Mayfield were written in the 70s. I think Klein was written in the 90s, and then the other one that I really like is the most recent one. It came out a year or two ago by the Australian author Deborah Pike, and she really delves into, she was able to go to the Princeton archives and look at what Zelda had been prescribed. So we now know what medicine she was prescribed, what doses, this guy, what treatments she received. And now we also have, with the benefit of history, to know how detrimental those treatments were. So I think that's something that will be unraveling, as the podcast progresses, is the question of her mental illness, all the varying treatments that she had, how questionable the doctors were, and how
much did that contribute
Yeah,
to
or cause.
problems in her life
Yeah.
that may not have been there if she hadn't been prescribed or treated in the way she was.
Well, just so listeners know now, one of the things that we're really looking into is she was administered what's called insulin shock therapy, which is now medical malpractice. It's just that simple. It's an insulin-induced coma. It's a miracle in a way she survived it. It was very popular at the time. So that and a lot of the drugs that she were given, we know what they are now. I don't know if Milford knew. I don't know if Mayfield has her own relationship to mental health and institutions, which is she had a very negative experience here in Alabama.
I think Milford accepts the schizophrenia diagnosis, which many people just today.
Well, Zelda's doctors in North Carolina did not accept that diagnosis. Just to be clear, we're not going to try to diagnose her ourselves or re-diagnose her. It's just that we do know so many of her treatments were detrimental and that modern or contemporary medical science refutes them and categorizes her treatment as malpractice. If it was done today, it would be malpractice. And to me, that's all you kind of... I have a PhD, but not psychiatry, so I don't want people to think that we're trying to diagnose her, but we are going to try to unravel. Maybe that's someone we can have come in and talk to us about, mental health, how it was thought of then, how the stigmas, how it's thought about now. But I think that's a major interest people have in her is the mental illness. But I also think it's very nebulous. And I don't know that anyone's dealt with it clearly.
Yeah, and unfortunately, she sort of gets pigeonholed as, this mentally ill woman when she had so much to offer. I mean, anybody who reads about Zelda and becomes fascinated with her life knows how brilliant a woman she was, how talented she was, what a fine writer she was. Wonderful artist. The ballet, we don't know, really. We don't have that much information. We have no film footage of her, unfortunately.
We have no film footage, but hopefully what we have been able to do is through a variety of archives. I think we should talk about where we get our information to. One, we are the Fitzgerald Museum, so we have a certain amount of particularly Zelda-related material that no other archive has. We have a significant portion of her library, and then we've also been able to recreate books that we know that she had through letters, whatnot. We also, through the Alabama State Archives, the University of Alabama Archives, some newspaper clippings, some information from the Princeton Archives, which you can see online, particularly her scrapbooks. We've been able to figure out who her original ballet teachers were here in Montgomery. We also know that 2 of her ballet teachers had been trained nationally at the highest levels. Mm-hmm. We then know who she took ballet with after leaving Montgomery, not just Igorova in Paris, but say Katherine Littlefield in Philadelphia. And we also have, I think, a clearer picture of her performances based in large part on newspaper clippings and not just letters, but the clippings. So I think we'll be able to piece together, if not the style, I think we can confidently say that she had a great talent. I don't know that she trained enough. And the one thing I do want, the thing that we get a lot at the museum is people think she tried to become a ballerina late in life. That is not true. She took ballet from being quite a young child with some very good dance teachers. The one dance teacher here that she dances with in high school and then takes classes with when she's here in the 30s, basically was a dance teacher to at least a dozen prominent dancers across the U.S. then. We'll get to that. But so we can't recreate, or we don't have footage, as you say, but I think we can confidently say Zelda had a great talent. The question was, she didn't seem to have the focus or discipline when she was younger, and then she may have turned to it too late to become a prima ballerina.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we do know she was offered
Yes.
she was offered positions in the opera in Italy, I believe.
Yes, in Naples. I think that she also danced with Katherine Littlefield, the Scott Fitzgerald. When we say Fitzgerald biographers, we're referring to Scott. I think the Fitzgerald biographer said that she was taking lessons in Philadelphia, but I've found a few indications that she was actually performing with Katherine Littlefield. She had these very large choruses. Katherine Littlefield was originally a Ziegfeld Follies dancer. She and her mother are some of the first women to form their own ballet company in Philadelphia in the U.S. She unfortunately dies young, relatively young. And there are various newspaper clippings nationally that Zelda was dancing with her. And then when you get more specific, you find that they were having these kind of large choruses, or as many as 25 dancers, but she was dancing. So I think there's a hint in the biographies, but she was doing more than taking ballet lessons. She was actually performing.
Yes. And of course she wrote very brilliantly about the ballet.
Yes. And I believe painted.
Yes.
I think that's one aspect of her painting that people don't realize, that I didn't realize, is that at the Princeton Archives, when you look through her writings and whatnot, she trained with the Ballet Russe, the Diaghilev, under Igorova, and part of a ballerina's training was not only dance, but it was also set and costume design. So when you look at her paper dolls, when you look at the watercolors that she did later in life for her grandchildren, they all have a very distinct ballet or theatrical look to them. Almost all the ballet characters, all the paper dolls are like ballet costumes.
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I was wondering, well, we know that she was going to the to Diaghilev's ballet. We know that she fell in love with a particular ballet called Le Chat, the cat, which she refers to in Save Me the Wall several times, and had great hopes to dance in it. Maybe we can look at some of the designs.
Yes. So we can look at that, but I also think that we have a book in our collection that I think was very instrumental. It's a book actually on scene design that we know that she had. So that's the one thing as we progress is we do have quite a number of her books that no other archive has. And if you're curious how we got them, when Scotty, their daughter, she lived in Montgomery until her death in '86. She knew that she had cancer, and apparently she began to just give things away. And since I've been at the museum as a volunteer and then as a director, it's about a year and a half ago, we have a little community library on the edge of the property of the museum, and people will drop off books so that we can put in it. It's very nice. So one morning we come in, bag of books is in the front entrance, little note in the top says, "Hope you can use these." We think they're for the little box, and they were Zelda and Scotty's books. So we have we have a very interesting insight, I think, that we'll be able to share that that aren't in the biographies, which I think will shed light. Kind of going back to the biography slightly, I do think all of them, now that we know so much more than they do, I have to say that all of them were on the right track. I think they all have a different flavor. They all have a different idea, but I don't see anything greatly wrong, just completely wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, occasionally they will get something wrong about Montgomery. They'll get a street name wrong or an area wrong, minor mistakes. But of course, interpretation is where maybe we will differ with them.
Yeah. I was rereading Mayfield, and Mayfield was talking about, there was a very interesting line that she had, and we'll come to that later, about how Zelda had said to this she'd gone on a date that she and Scott's engagement was tentative, that she'd gone on this date with this guy, which was kind of, not uncommon then. And then that she said that she wasn't really in love with him, but she felt that it was her duty to help him be successful. And then she says, so she wasn't in love with him. Mayfield takes a swipe at all the Scott biographers, saying, they just said that she had just ecstatically in love with Scott.
Yes.
And that she didn't think so. So I think that we'll kind of delve into that, the contrast that some of these different biographers have, and then maybe add, maybe a few of our opinions as well.
Yes.
Because we get a lot.
And being in Montgomery, there are people around who knew people who knew Zelda and who have their own ideas of what their relationship, Scott and Zelda's relationship, was. So maybe we can hear from them, or maybe they can tell us, and we can report it to you.
Yes, hopefully we will. In terms of structure, we are setting the podcast up. We will hopefully be having some interviews of people in and around town to give background around Montgomery. We'll see how many people are willing to talk about if their remembrance of Zelda. I asked my grandmother if she would, because she would tell me stories. And then when I became more involved with the museum, she kind of clammed up, I don't really remember it. And I finally confronted her and said, come on, I know you remember. I remember. Why won't you say anything now? And she says, I didn't know Zelda was famous till the book came out. She just thought she was the lady in the neighborhood. And so she was a little embarrassed. So you do have a lot of people around Montgomery that still have that point of view. She's the hometown celebrity. They didn't realize that she's internationally famous, which is interesting because we get so many international guests here at the museum.
We do indeed, from all over the world. It's amazing. Some of them are here, of course, I guess, because of F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yes.
But we get many people here who are devotees of Zelda.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we are.
Yes. So if you have any questions or any mysteries that you want us to help unravel, please email us. You can email us right now at FitzMuse, FitzMuse @gmail.com. We will have all the social media for the Peaches and Biscuits podcast, so check us out later for that. Our tentative start date is April 3rd or 4th for launching. This will be the 100th anniversary of their marriage. We will have, hopefully, a FitzMuse podcast network. We are working on a Gatsby Old Sports, hopefully to launch in the fall, which will be similar. We will be... we're looking at, I should say, Scott's podcast, which will be comparable to this one on Zelda. And also under the FitzMuse, we will be doing more contemporary issues. Our goal is to continue their legacies, both in literature, arts, painting, performing arts, because they had a great interest in popular culture. They were they defined popular culture for an entire era. So with them as our inspiration, as our muses, we want to continue that, hopefully in their name, and so that will all fall under the FitzMuse podcast. So if there's any area of the 20s or contemporary culture that you want us to cover or have any recommendations, please send them to us. Again, that's at FitzMuse@gmail.com. You can also visit the museum's website, which is thefitzgeraldmuseum.org, so THE, fitzgeraldmuseum.org, and hope to see you at the museum.